Welcome back to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I am your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. Hey, everybody. This is the second part of a multi-part episode. If you like what you're hearing, go like, subscribe, go check us out on YouTube. So here we go. It really makes sense, too, because yeast is not what you would think of today as you buy that little packet and you throw it in the bread. Yeast was a living creature in your house. And I can totally see that could be a big part of starting over, that we're going to chuck out last year's yeast. And even if the yeast is still good, and clearing out your house of all the yeasted products. I mean, we do the same thing nowadays. It's January 1st. That's when you finally start going back to the gym and you, I'm not going to eat that. I'm going to start eating healthy again. It's the same thing. Yeah, it's the same mentality.
Yeah. Exactly. We are the same people that they were. We are not different whatsoever. We are not smarter or stupider or nothing. We're just exactly the same. And if on January 1st, 2025, something amazing happens, as amazing as what happens to them, what happened to them, that would just be like world peace. Let's say January 1st, 2025, there's an announcement, world peace. Of course, people will throw out, something like the yeast from the previous year. And a lot of things will be symbolically a new beginning and stuff. Obviously, because this was like an unbelievable event for them. They had been like 49 years in Babylonian captivity. And just like that, you can leave. You don't have to pay anything. Just take your stuff, go. It encourages everybody to be nice to them and to give them gifts to go back home. And this occasion was so unbelievable that this is the occasion that I think that gave birth to the phrase hallelujah. Because it's unbelievable what happened. It's really, really hallelujah. Not only one thing, two things, unbelievable, just like that. So it makes sense that there will be a festival about it. And I think it's possible.
Absolutely. And I think you can also build into there something that I've talked about in the last couple of series, and your thoughts have inspired me, is you start to build the othering too, that the people who went back were generally the highest class people, wealthy. Then they come back to essentially the country bumpkins, the people who didn't get taken with the high status people back to Babylon. They're very different people at this point, even after just a few generations. Yeah. You think about how many generations. I had just as a thought experiment, if I went back 6-7 generations, the people that were essentially staying the same wherever my great-great-great-grandparents, I'm very different from them. And I might want to set up things that other me from them. And I want to set up rules and establish guidelines that say, hey, I am not those people.
Yeah. And then I think it's weird, like the farther you get from the communal events, just the more aggressive the people with power become in enforcing new rules. This is the way we do things. I think, maybe this is like a universal thing. Like the more, harder it is to keep everything in line, the more effort some people will put to keep everything in line and supposedly unchanging, right?
Then the idea that Passover is the new year, it's completely logical that it's a spring festival. You're into the traditional life cycle of renewal, death of winter, leading into the renewal of the new planting, new animals. But that's not that the new year would turn into Rosh Hashanah. And do you have any thoughts and ideas of why it would turn into a fall festival?
I do. I looked at what is recorded in the Mishnah, the Hebrew Mishnah. That's text from 100 CE, give or take, to 100 CE, give or take, something like that. But they were written at that time, but they were passed on orally from Maccabean times, we talked about before. From the time, for example, 140 BCE, have information about the people in power at that time. And this is recorded in the Mishnah. And the festivals are recorded in the Mishnah. And the spring festival is recorded in the Mishnah as the first day of the year and everything. But the Rosh Hashanah, that was traditionally the fall. That's the mid-year festival. A universal thing. It's the mid-year festival. The Hellenistic year began in the fall. The Seleucids, who ruled Judea, they instituted 100 years earlier or something like that, like a new calendar that doesn't reset with the kings, with the changing kings. It's just like a calendar, like the numbering of the years, how we do today. Year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 never ends. Okay? It started in the fall. And when the Maccabees took power in 140 BCE, they started counting the same years the Hellenistic were counting, but they said, no, we're going to call it Hebrew year 1 for the numbering of the years. This has nothing to do with spring coming in and the first day of the natural world and year. Right? This is just like to number the years, two different things. They used to do it with the second year of this or that king, the seventh year of that king. Didn't matter if the king falls in the fall, or he dies in spring. The year begins in spring, right? It's two unrelated things. So it became confusing later when in the Mishnah, the information that was recorded there is that in the fall, you have Rosh Hashanah Lashanim, the beginning of the counting of the years, and the beginning of the Shemitah years. Do you know Shemitah? That's like every 7 years. You have to let other people use your land or give them your land. It's every 7 years again. And every 49 years, the 50th year, it's like the holiest year ever. So the Hebrews, like in Europe, in the year 200 or 300, they confused the two things about when the numbering of the year begins and the beginning of the tax year. Basically, what I said about the 7 years, it's basically real estate tax, right? For the rich people, every 7 years, you have to give some away. And they thought that this was the beginning of the year. And they took away this title from Passover and gave it to Rosh Hashanah, which used to be the Rosh Hashanah HaIvrit, we even call it today, the first of the Hebrew year, in contrast to the Seleucid Hellenistic year that started at exactly the same place, at the same time. And then there was probably a gap of 10 days that they had to bridge either forward or backwards. And these 10 days, it became a meme that is recurring in the Hebrew calendar wars that ensued. Like they tried to take back 10 days because for the priests, the calendar was very important. It all has to be connected exactly to the first day of spring because of what happened on the first day of spring, 538 BC. So if you change the calendar, it's a theological problem, right? The end of the world. So the priests, they start to count the end of the world 49 days or weeks or years in the future, they predict. This also gives rise, right, to a lot of apocalyptic literature and stuff. Yeah. Did that make sense, or that was okay?
No, it's fascinating because you start peeling back the layers and things make so much sense. I think what was the Hebrew word you used for the 7 years?
Shemitah.
Is that the same as Jubilee years? I think that
exactly. Yeah.
So that might be a word that our English speakers would be more familiar with. Is the Jubilee year that every 7 years you have to give something back, And that I believe also there was something to do with forgiveness of debts to some degree.
Exactly.
And then the seventh Jubilee year, the seventh was the mega super one, the 49th year. Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like James Early's Key Battles of American History podcast and many other great shows. Go over to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors.
Exactly, to commemorate the 49 years that they spent in the Babylonian captivity and then came back. So in 140 BCE, what we didn't have a chance to talk about it yet, I'll just talk about it briefly. The new rules are basically directed to exclude the priests from Passover. You cannot go to the temple. You cannot leave your house until morning. Okay? You cannot boil the Passover lamb. That's what the priests used to do. And everybody slaughters and sacrifices the Passover lamb, not just the priests in the temple, right? Everybody must. That's what the rules say. Everybody must slaughter the lamb at home and put the blood on the door frames, which is what the priests used to do in the temple. They put the blood on the door frames of the altar and of the doors of the temple and of the compound and all that. So the rules change, and they say now everybody does it at home, and then it turns like the political power takes it away from the temple and spreads it, in the home where people gather. And when the temple is no more, the homes where people gather. Gathering homes, that's Bet Knesset, that's the Hebrew word for synagogue. That became, over time, where Hebrews met, to talk about whatever they want to talk about when the temple was gone. I think this started in 140 BCE. And in Passover, we see that you have to celebrate it in your home. And I forgot to mention it. Archaeology tells us that around 140 BCE, a few years before or after that, everybody in Judea started celebrating Passover in their homes and not in the temple. This is that you can look at Jonathan Adler. He published a few years ago very research about that, but he doesn't know how to explain it. Why did they change it 100%? I think the rules changed. That's the only way that everybody changes on a dime, like stop doing one religious tradition and starting a new one. Has to be that the rules change. These rules, we can see them in Exodus 12 and 13.
Yeah, and that's another thing that's hugely discordant in a society that was so focused on the temple. This major celebration has nothing to do with the temple whatsoever. It's completely diffuse, home-based activity. That's strange.
Yeah, and why would it be in the rules that you are not allowed to go out until morning and that you're not allowed to take any of the meat outside of the house? Like, why are they so strict about it? So you will not go to the temple. Basically, just like you cannot go to the temple. Why did they turn the boiling of the lamb into roasting it? Because they're just doing exactly the opposite of whatever the other people were doing before.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Now let's lead into the Maccabees. And what's the short story? Again, I think that anybody who listens to our mutual podcast are more than familiar with the Maccabees. But if somebody is just dropping in, who were these guys and what was their setting? Where did they come out of? Because that's another fascinating one. One other thing that you mentioned that I thought was really interesting is that changing of the new beginning of the year to the fall, because that's something that we get a remnant of to this very day is in the Greek Christian communities. They start their new year on September 1st, which they call the beginning of the ecclesiastical new year. But that stemmed from the Byzantine secular New Year, which must have carried on from the Seleucid New Year or that Hellenistic idea of the New Year. So, I mean, That's a lot. You're getting towards the core of the onion there with the peeling those layers back. It makes
Wow.
a lot of
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah. If we just, when we see a pattern, if we just keep going along that pattern, we'll get somewhere interesting. And I think to the core of the onion. So let me talk a little bit about the Maccabees, and then we can and connect that to Easter and Christianity, because this is what leads into that, I think. So basically, after 400 years of priestly domination, and the priestly caste, it's a little bit like the Brahmin caste in India. Like a priestly caste is something that is inherently, that people do not like, because it's like people who have all the power and they are pure and they feel that they're better than everybody else, and you have to pay them for them to do the things that you have to pay them to do, because they are the only ones who can communicate with God. And in Judea, they were tax exempt also. So they became more and more rich. And they became more and more Persianized. And then when the Hellenists came over, they became Hellenized. And eventually, it's basically a little bit like the Protestant Reformation. So the priests, they are like the Catholics. And the Maccabees, that would be like we're calling them the Maccabees, basically, let's call it a Maccabean coalition. All kinds of anti-priestly forces collaborating at a particular point in time to topple the priests and to kick out the Hellenistic Seleucids. So it's a war of independence and a civil war at the same time. So a lot of dead young men from, both from the priestly families and from the masses. Thousands of people died, only young. This meant that the Hebrews that won and established their state, they sacrificed their firstborn, metaphorically and not metaphorically, to Yahweh. Yahweh was on their side. But the rules of Passover, they said that the priests protect your firstborn through the sacrifice at the temple. 140 BC, this is, nobody likes the priests at that time. They were fighting with the enemies, collaborating with the enemies. They're not saving and redeeming our dead boys, right? Our boys are died for Yahweh in their eyes, for God and independence. So I think that this created like a very, very strong rift that you can see in Exodus. And then if we project that later to Christianity, and then if we go back a little bit earlier to Persian times, so the world is awoken and reborn every spring, right? And Cyrus was the Messiah, the Bible tells us, and he freed the Hebrews in spring. So then there's another Messiah that comes and is reborn in spring, right? So that works in that way for Easter. And I think this is, speculation theory, that the fact that Easter, and correct me about the Christian stuff, right? If I'm stepping out of bounds a little bit, the fact that God says, "I sacrificed my boy for you," I think this is an answer, like the closing of the loop that starts in 538 BC. We have to sacrifice that our boys belong to you. And then 140 BCE, we sacrificed our boys in this war of independence, civil war for you. And then around, I don't know what time, Christian times, God says, "Okay, I also sacrificed my boy for you. This is the new covenant." Just like now I'm talking about it, I'm getting goosebumps. I think this is something like very like emotionally potent. I feel it like viscerally. This is something that is very attractive and appealing and alluring. Like, oh, God sacrificed his boy for me? Unbelievable. So that's the way that I see it.
That is fascinating. I'm getting a little goosebumpy there too. That really is closing the loop, that this would have been something that was intimately in people's minds, this idea that the Maccabees, that we had this revolt that killed our firstborn, our boys, and that God is going to come around to kill his own son Wow,
Also, in
that's
Roman times,
powerful
they lost
stuff.
a lot of boys, right? It wasn't just in their memories, right? In that time, in Jesus' time,
Yeah. And those,
so it
yeah,
was,
the revolt, the 70s revolts.
yeah, it's any one of them. I mean, like to your
Yeah.
point, that this was also like present in their lives at the same, like at this very moment. Sorry, I cut you off with the energy. You had like good energy
Oh,
with.
no, not at all. I'm still thinking, absorbing it.
There's something here, like, and also it's such an emotionally gripping story that if I'm, trying to imagine what it would be like to live at that time, I think that all of them were Hebrews, and some of them went this way, and some of them went another way, and that basically Judaism and Christianity are sister religions that both come out of, let's call it Hebrewism, because we don't have a better name. And I can imagine why early Christians would be upset with Hebrews, with Jews not joining them, because if you close the loop, you close the lid. It's so perfect, it's so beautiful. Why aren't you with us? Right? There's something like
Yeah, I think Gary Stevens and I, and we've talked a lot. A big part of our speculations was this time period, and we would call it Second Temple Judaism. This idea that came out of really the post-return, the post-exile, that people at that time period, say the first century BCE, first century CE, had a whole buffet of ideologies and theologies and philosophies that they could pull from. And the Christians picked and chose a little of this, a little of that. The modern rabbinical Jews who were growing out of certain groups, I'm going to take a scoop of this, a scoop of that. And that's really where the divergence is. And it really wouldn't take until after, say, the first revolt, and then the Bar Kokhba revolt, and eventually that, then you're starting to get into that other, I can't remember the name of the author, but he wrote a book called Borderlines, where how these two different groups had to, Christians, since they didn't have an ethnos, as they would call it back then, they weren't a people as such, because by the 130s CE, that 130s, 150s, they're Greeks, there's Romans, there's Phoenicians, there's all these different people who are glomming on. So we can't say we're an ethnic group. So now we have to draw our borderlines that it's a theology that's separating us as a group. Whereas the proto-rabbinical Jews, they have an ethnos. That's how they are going to draw their lines around them. They'll build their fences as an ethnic group. And the theology, they can be a little looser on. The Christians, we don't have an ethnic group. We have to build our fence around this theology.
Right. And, common traditions. But still, we can, to your point about how the buffet of options, even like the spread of Christianity. German Christianity is different from Russian Christianity.
Yeah.
Just like Judaism today, Polish Judaism is different from Moroccan. Like, this is a truism in the world, that you always choose your stories from the ones that are available. Right? If you in Israel today, you want to, let's say, retire from society and go on some religious journey, you will become ultra-Orthodox, because this is one of the options available for you. If you live in India and you want to go through an exactly similar journey, the options available for you are to go and become like these wandering people who go and, people give food along the way, because this is what the options that they have. So this is, I think this is the same for every cultural development.
And I really do love the idea that this sort of spirals, that they're building these stories on the ancient stories, and they're really reimagining them. And that's so powerful. It's such that storytelling people want to look at history like it's this scientific thing that you can put equations onto and equals, answer. And our storytelling is as much a part of our history as any of the individual facts are. Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors.
I agree. I think the stories are much more important than we understand. Like, it's basically a little bit like our, consciousness is made of stories, right? Our inner voice, everything is made of stories. Our culture is made of stories. We communicate, we tell stories. This is what I did yesterday. This is what you did today. I think there's something very, very primal in stories. And when they grab us, just like you feel it. You feel it. Yes, this is the story.
I think too, whenever I read any of these stories or think about them, I always think about there's a professor of New Testament at Duke, I believe, Mark Goodacre, who talks about, I don't think he invented this saying, but it's history mythologized and mythology historicized. And that's the process that we go through, is we backdate some things to make, and I mean, you do it in your life, I do it in my life, even that a story has to, an event that happened, we don't look at it clinically. We fit it into our schema of what are we doing right now? What do we envision ourselves being at a later point? It is as absolutely, it's boiled into us.
Right. And we can compare it, let's say, to how the image of President Washington, George Washington, how the perception of him and the stories about him changed throughout the time. Let's say when he lived, people, told one set of stories. 100 years later, the world has changed. There were different political, beefs. And then someone would say, George Washington, he would be on this side and he would do this. And then somebody else would say the opposite. And then, because even our old stories, they always change according to what the world is at in the present time as we're reading / writing. It's like when Passover comes, you want to tell this story, you want to make it contemporary. The freedom, the liberty, this is for the hostages in Gaza. Okay, this is, for example, what they do today. We make it relevant and you tell the story this way. And I think American Jews, they have this tradition, not sure, that every Passover they tell the story of the Exodus in a more contemporary way, relevant to our times. I think they have this sort of tradition. I think so. It's just something that people do all the time.
Yeah, and those layers that get built on locally, that's something that at one point was just an add-on, can sometimes get cast off, or it can work its way into an essential element of the ceremony or of the holiday.
Right. Or anything cultural. Like, some historical figures are very popular at some point period in time, long after they're dead, and then they become unpopular, and then they become popular again. They haven't changed, right? They've been dead all this time. People change, and now, at this point in time, these stories are interesting and they're relevant for us. And these stories, they can be, an economic vision or human rights. It doesn't matter. It's all stories, right? Story format. It can be philosophy, it can be theology.
One of the things that makes me think of that is I posted this to social media to be a little bit of a stir up a little controversy. I said that Easter is not a pagan holiday and has no connection. And somebody came and said, well, Easter, it's the Anglo-Saxon or Germanic goddess of something or another. And what about bunnies? And you think about how, like, that's somebody who hasn't really thought much about these or done the level of reading that most of the people who listen to this podcast do, is that in almost every language, the Christian word for Easter is Pascha or some derivative of that, which it goes back to the Hebrew word Pesach, which is the word for Passover. And it's really only in English and German where Easter is the word. And then but that's so ingrained in our culture that Easter, so then you make that natural bridge that it has to be something to do with the spring goddess of Germanic paganism. And then you think of the bunnies, of how ubiquitous bunnies and chocolate and that sort of thing are, that they've woven themselves into an essential element of the holiday. But if you go to other Christian cultures, they don't really do anything with bunnies at all.
Yeah, that's so weird. I see that every holiday is based on a pagan holiday because it's based on something that was before.
Yeah.
So before these, people came up with these religions. Passover is based on Nowruz, the spring festival, the Persian spring festival. The Nowruz table is very much similar to the Passover table that I laid out.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Earlier. I also I just learned this, researching Passover. Exactly the same table with symbolic dishes, and the table in Hebrew is called Seder, and the Nowruz table is called Haftin, because all of the dishes have to start with like Seder. So all the symbolic dishes. You have like a sweet dish. We also have a sweet dish, a salty dish, a bitter dish. It's exactly the same. It's about hospitality. So it's basically just a Hebrew Nowruz festival that just changed. It started this way, but then it became something.
Yeah, and I think
and it makes sense. Sorry, just to cap out that point. It makes sense that it would be a Nowruz festival because we know that the priests wrote it in Persian times, and Nowruz was the imperial festival, still celebrated today by, tens and hundreds of millions of people. And Passover, even today, is very small. Back then, was even smaller. It can't have influenced Nowruz, right? It's not possible. It's the other way. So if it started in the Persian time, then it's exactly the same time and has the same table with the same sound.
Yeah, I think to your point is that absolutely these holidays and these special days, they have to come from something that's rooted to the way people lived at one point, that the cycle of sowing and reaping and all of those things would have been of absolute critical importance. And then they would have tied a religious element to that, because if the crops failed, it must have been because we somehow failed the gods or something. And then as time goes on, that those things become less contextualized and become more decontextualized.
Exactly. Because they change over time. Also, I think we can compare it, like the importance that ancient people get to that, we can compare it even to our routines. So, like, I don't know about you, but I love my routines. And the more I do a certain routine, like, the more important it becomes, right? It gains like an added value, like a mystical experience, not mystical experience, but like an emotional experience that is beyond the actual drinking of the coffee, the specific coffee in a specific cafe. It becomes something more. And if you break your routine, it's, it could be a little bit disconcerting. So let's say that if you have, a lot of people have the same routine in spring, and their parents had, and their grandparents, and now your children and grandchildren, it becomes like the routine itself becomes what's important. And you lose the connection that where it started, that we do this for spring, it works, let's keep doing it. Because we had a few good springs, and then it just becomes about the ceremony. And you believe that this is what brings good spring.
Exactly, because those people returning from the Babylonian exile would have been probably more connected to the land than most people are today. but the land they were a lot more urbanized, a lot more tied into that culture, and maybe getting their hands dirty was an idea, and people did it that was closer to us, but it wouldn't have been as important. Like I have stumbled into, I do some agriculture now. I keep bees, and the spring is a time that I have to keep a lot closer eye on than I would have ever had to have. Oh, is it raining? Now that it's raining more, and I mean, it's even crazy that I'm looking for certain flowers to bloom. Oh, the bluebonnets have bloomed. The next one is called Indian paintbrush, and I know once that happens, that's going to trigger something. And once you get connected into those cycles, but if there's a bad winter or too much rain, then that's pretty bad. And I could see that if that was my livelihood and life or death depended on that, I'd be investing my spiritual energy into something more so than something else.
And just imagine that you are a child and your father explained this to you. This already becomes something else. It's already mystical.
Yeah.
And then when you are, 20, 30, and then you explain that to your son, there's a lot of emotional layers on top of that. And it's no wonder that it's stuck for so long. And I think that it's no wonder that specifically Passover and Easter stuck, because their very root, their core is what I think is like the happiest time in world history for like the most people, the most happy. The beginning of spring 538 BCE, when Cyrus, king of Persia, told all the captives, you can go, millions of people. Either you can go or you can stay, but then you're equal citizens and everybody is the same. Your religion, go rebuild your temple. You can write whatever you want to write, everything, freedom, peace, happiness. Such an amazing period that it gave birth to festivals and rules that are still celebrated today. So a good start can go a long way. Strong start.
I mean, Gil, I think we've just scratched the surface here, and I would love to have you back on, especially to do speculations, because I think Gary and I have talked about this a lot, is that, we don't have the PhDs and we're not chairs of different departments, but we have a lot of room to discuss these things. And I definitely would love to hear what people are thinking about all of these issues out there. And if there's more to talk about, definitely send us emails. And I know there's going to be more to talk to you about, Gil. So anytime, you are always welcome to come back on the show.
Thank you. And if anybody has another theory, another hypothesis that connects everything that we talked about, right? Because it's all connected, right? All of the historical events and the stories and the festivals that were connected, they rely on each other. So it makes the foundation of this speculation, quote unquote, I think very strong. If you have a better way to look at the whole thing, or if we missed something here or there, happy to listen. Of course, we keep learning.
Hey, before we go, let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the history of the papacy diptychs. We have, at the Alexandria level, Roberto, William B., Brian, Christina, Augustus, Judy, and Max. At the Constantinople, we have Dapo, Paul, Justin, Lana, John, Steve, and Sean, all of whom are magnificent and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great, Amma the Great, Geoffrey the Great, Frederick the Great, and Jim the Great. With that, I hope you enjoy this next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church.